It's Friday, it's just gone 2 o'clock, and you're listening to the Slow Small Peasants on Resonance 104.4 FM. This week we're continuing our series on codes with a show about codes of control and also resistance to those codes.
We live in the information age, so codes today are more important. We live in the information age. We live in the information age. We live in the information age. Codes today.
Simon, sing.
You talk about sort of an evolutionary process of codes developing. Is it possible that you can sort of summarise this evolution for us?
Yes, it goes back to the day that somebody wrote down a message. The first time anybody wrote something in their diary or sent a secret political message or inscribed anything. One of the most ancient messages that was encrypted was a pottery glaze, a recipe for pottery that was written in cuneiform but then encoded. And so ever since we began writing down messages, we began trying to write them down in secret. And as soon as people started writing down secret messages, people tried to decode those messages. So I come up with a code, you try and break it. As soon as you try and break it, I try and come up with a better code. When you break that, I come up with a better code. And as each century's gone by, the code breakers have got smarter, and the code makers in turn have had to get smarter too. Right now, in this battle between code makers and code breakers, the code makers are certainly ahead. Today we've got effectively unbreakable codes, but in the meantime the code breakers are trying to find a way of cracking them, and if and when they do, then the code makers will have to come up with something even cleverer.
We do not save your credit card information after your order is complete. We also do not share any of your information with anyone. Your name and address are protected by 2 levels of encryption that even the National Security Agency would have trouble with. In other words, we know a thing or two.
Access to these secret codes. Now that's great because you and I can send each other private emails and nobody will know what we're saying. It's great for businesses because they can conduct communications with their clients in absolute secrecy. So there are a lot of good things that come with these codes. The downside is that the criminals, the organised criminals, the drug dealers, the terrorists, the bad guys also have access to these codes. And that means that they can communicate to each other in absolute secrecy.
Tim Jordan.
Who owns and controls the code?
Assuming you're talking about the internet, then the code is owned and controlled in a number of layers. Ultimately, the internet is owned and controlled by the United States government, who delegates authority to control how we find things on the internet to a thing called ICANN, Internet Corporation of Assigned Numbers. ICANN's authority comes directly from the Department of Commerce in the US, which a couple of years ago, when the system for assigning internet numbers, which is ultimately the way we find things on the internet, when that system reached a particular point where its administration had to be changed because of the growth of the internet, the US asserted control and ownership of the root server, which is the ultimate high-level server, which controls all its distribution. That code is now controlled by ICANN, which is a kind of international organisation which has representatives and some elected members, although it's effectively an appointed body. And its future and the future of this particular level of code is currently under discussion. There's a World Summit on information systems going on. I guess the important thing about code is that it's controlled by whoever writes it. That means that all the different levels and layers of code that now are intertwined in our life, from the code that's kind of hardwired into a washing machine to the code that controls how you find things on the internet at the highest level, is controlled by whoever writes it. It's therefore a matter of usually large corporations and or governments who control the kind of muscle, the kind of software writing muscle which can control and formulate code. But it's also the province of people who write it. So you find lots of people doing basically hacking of code, bringing up their own forms of code and so on. So there is a kind of, within the kind of overall control of code, there are kind of pockets of alternative forms of code emerging. Just to illustrate that as an example, one of the earliest hacktivist groups was a group called the Electro Hippies. It had one very public member who would go to conferences and do the speaking and do the press releases. It had a number of very unpublic members, all of whom worked for software writing firms, and therefore wanted their involvement to a certain extent secret. But they controlled code in both contexts, both in the context of writing hacktivist oppositional code and in the context of writing either their corporate or governmental jobs writing code.
Technological tools, internet, SMS, Skype, email lists, online notice boards, servers. Technological tools, internet, SMS, Skype, email lists, online notice boards.
Interestingly, I should introduce at this point, because the mass online protests are only one part of hacktivism, and there have been severe criticisms of the mass online protests by other hacktivists. There's a group that have been dubbed by some members of the electronic disturbancy to the digitally correct hacktivists. Now, they're people who tend to be much more associated and closely associated with the hacking community and with open source issues than often the mass action activists, who tend to come most often from a close association with activism. Digitally correct hacktivists tend to be focused very much on the writing of code themselves in order to formulate the nature of the internet. So they're often not necessarily focused on anti-globalization issues per se, but focused on things that support protests. So they're very particularly concerned with free access to information on the internet. In that they connect to not just kind of issues around the ultra-globalization movement, but also issues of particularly American libertarian kind of libertarians who are associated often with the internet and with code writing. So they've done things like writing particular programs in order to smuggle information across national firewalls. So, for example, if you have somewhere like Singapore where information is filtered, or the famous example always given is China these days, where information is constantly filtered and so on. They've been writing programs to try and allow information to be transferred illicitly across, and therefore to keep the internet open and free for information transfer. Now, those activists have criticised very heavily mass action activists for attempting to close down websites rather than for engaging in open debate. So it's a debate that occurs not just from outside hacktivists and what they do, but it's a debate that occurs from within them as well.
I'm Count Zero from the Cult of the Dead Cow. We like to we have a large spectrum of interests, and we're interested in having a good time, getting crazy, but we're also interested in trying to change the world a little bit, making it more interesting, maybe making it a little bit better. So a few years ago we started getting involved in hacktivism. We did invent the name hacktivism, yeah. Omega in CDC invented the term hacktivism. So every time you say the word hacktivism, we get a quarter. It's awesome.
As Zero said, we've been working with hacktivism mostly because we invented it, but it has in fact gone out, and there are many flavors. But we have a very clear definition of what we believe hacktivism to be. For us, it is using technology to improve human rights across electronic media. Hacktivismo, the subgroup within the CDC that's been doing a lot of work in hacktivism, has been primarily interested in opening up the internet in these so-called firewalled countries through developing applications or working with grassroots organizations and the human rights community. For us, technology and human rights go together. There's certain even tactics that we think are appropriate. For instance, Zero was mentioning that we started off by writing a lot of T files, and that was really the first sort of incarnation or mandate of the CDC, and it was really all about free speech. And then when we started working with hacktivism and trying to, get past all of these firewalls, a lot of people couldn't figure it out. We're supposed to be a bunch of goofy guys who write files like Sex with Satan and Bunny Lust, and the gerbil feed bomb is my particular favorite, the first file. And so what does that have to do with opening up the internet? Well, there really is a straight line from free speech to somebody being able to hear your free speech.
Can you highlight or illustrate for us some early examples of hacktivistic activities?
There are a couple of very early examples. The earliest example was by a group called the Electronic Disturbance Theatre. It's the most famous and well-known, a thing called Floodnet. This was a group of activists, some of whom came out of the Critical Arts Ensemble, who'd done some of the first theorisation or conceptualisation of hacktivism in the early 90s, where they'd argued that hacktivism needed to emerge, some kind of protest within the kind of electronic kind of veins of modern societies needed to emerge. Floodnet was a means of, as its name suggests, flooding a targeted computer with requests for information. So at its most fundamental, what it did is it allowed people to log on, to participate in a protest by kind of hosting the code, which then would target particular computers. Early on, the kind of classic sites, because this was usually Zapatista support actions being undertaken, the classic sites would be things like the President of Mexico's homepage. They also targeted things like the Pentagon, And at one stage they targeted the Frankfurt Stock Exchange because of perceived links between certain companies listed there and Zapatista action. This also had a kind of particular kind of art activist, in common with lots of the ultra-globalisation movement, had a particular artistic kind of bent to it. So it had a kind of particular part of it where you could interrogate the site, and it would you would ask it to find, say, justice on the site or human rights, and it would give back the classic internet error 405, not found on this site. So you would then get back a page which said
Error 404. Justice not found on President of Mexico City.
Error 404. Justice not found on President of Mexico's site.
Error 404. Justice not found on President of Mexico's site. Their aim was always, quite clearly, not to destroy the opposition. It was not to bring down and close down the opposing server, the opposing computer, but to slow it down and to make the protest known.
The first forms of hacktivism that you mentioned, which was the communication element, is that also an incredibly important part of the early hacktivistic era with, for example, the Zapatista calling for or supporting global days of action or huge mobilizations, and in some way closing or breaching the distance between global grassroots movements?
Yes, it's facilitated enormously the ability to communicate and to organise without having to actually be physically co-present to each other. Of course, that's always been done. You know, the kind of anti-slavery movement of the 19th century featured people writing letters and so on to each other. What it's done is kind of take it to a whole qualitatively different new level because of the sheer amount of it. At the moment, in common with lots of us in all sorts of walks in life, the difficulty now is often too much information rather than not enough, which used to be often the previous difficulty, getting access to information. Whereas now the difficulty often is the amount of time, say, an email list can produce in trying to organise something, can absorb activists' efforts almost on its own. But it's been, particularly because of the global nature of the ultra-globalisation movement as it's emerged, it's been incredibly important. We shouldn't forget that these are always embedded within kind of face-to-face practices. So, and again, just references always to the Zapatistas, but it's just as an example, a kind of proclamation or bulletin or story from Subcommandant Marcos, for example, or from the commandants in control of the EZLN, would first of all come out and have to be smuggled out of the zones. So someone would have to physically remove it. You know, if it, probably ridden on a horse in the saddle of a horse out to someone who then takes it on a truck and so on. It would then get eventually to a point at which it would be able to be entered into the internet and sent to someone. Once it hits the internet, though, it can be global extremely quickly. So you get a very nice kind of illustration of the difference between a kind of world where things have to be handled and a world where almost instantly you can spread a message far and wide.
Humanity and against neoliberalism. July 27, 1996. Aguascalientes 2, Oventic, San Andrés Sacamachén de los Pobres, Chiapas, México. Brothers and sisters of Asia, Africa, Oceania, Europe, and America, welcome to the mountains of the Mexican Southeast. Let us introduce ourselves. We are the Zapatista National Liberation Army. For 10 years, we lived in these mountains, preparing to fight a war. In these mountains, we built an army. Below, in the cities and plantations, we did not exist. Our lives were worth less than those of machines or animals. We were like stones, like weeds in the road. We were silenced. We were faceless. We were nameless. We had no future. We did not exist. For the powers that be, known internationally by the term neoliberalism, we did not count. We did not produce, we did not buy, we did not sell. We were a cipher in the accounts of big capitals. Then we went to the mountains to find ourselves and see if we could ease the pain of being forgotten like stones and weeds. Here, in the mountains of the Mexican Southeast, our dead live on. Our dead will live in the mountains, know many things. They speak to us of their dead, and we hear them. Coffins speaks and tell us another story that comes from yesterday and points to tomorrow. The mountains spoke to us, the Masewalop. We common and ordinary people. We are simple people, as power tells us. Every day and the next night, power wants us to dance the ex-doll and repeat this brutal conquest. The Castzul, the false man, rules our lands and has giant war machines, like the Bob, half puma and half horse, that spread pain and death among us.
Popular subject with people that program computers, and popular even with non-computer people. Kids like it. I first became interested in cryptography when I was 10 years old by reading a children's book on codes and secret writing. This book was taught about making codes from substitution alphabets and writing in invisible ink made from lemon juice and things of that nature. I did write some encryption software pretty early in my history of writing software. It wasn't very good, but I didn't know that at the time.
You're listening to the Slow Small Peasants on Resonance 104.4 FM, and this week's show is about the codes of control and codes of resistance.
Copyright. Property. Free and open source software. Collaboration. Non-proprietary.
I think the real important thing about open source software is that nobody has ever had the power of pulling technology that you use from you. It's the most important thing, I think.
I think it's a fine thing because I don't like big companies in general to start off with, and I think that the freer and the more things can be shared, then obviously the better it is for humanity as a whole.
I think there's a number of motivations. I enjoy writing software, and I get paid to write software, proprietary software, but I actually, on my own time, I volunteer to write open source free software, partly because I get to choose what I do, so I can choose the things that are of interest to me. I enjoy the fact that I know others around the world are using my software, but I also feel that I'm creating an alternative model for wealth creation that doesn't involve money, that involves collaboration and sharing, as opposed to profit making and I guess the competing.
I'm very, very positive about it. I think there's a real sort of generosity about the whole thing which should be encouraged the world over. Less kind of evil corporations and more nice, kind people sharing their ideas.
Because of internet technologies, we can actually have other people from remote locations contribute to our project and comment on it. And that is very interesting. I mean, not every morning, but it happens quite often that I have comments when I'm waking up in the morning by some people in Paris that had actually fixed the bug before I had seen it while I was sleeping. And this is quite interesting. I mean, the way of actually using positively the globalization, like internet, in a interesting way. Definitely, one thing that's interesting in open source.
Copyright, I mean, a lot of the net is made up of elements, particles of information that are owned and copyrighted and patented. I mean, with the kind of burgeoning society of free open source software developers and creationists, I mean, copyright, is that something now that we actually have to start looking at? Because we can't replicate things as free if they're already owned. I mean, even things like, our genetic code is owned and patented now. So, I mean, kind of how do we move forward now in terms of starting to have a bit of a revolution in the ownership of the information on the net? Because otherwise I think it's hard to move forward if every element of knowledge becomes owned.
Property is a key, is going to be, or has become a really key battleground for this kind of freedom to be able to transfer information. And one of the interesting things is that you have to initially get away from a language of free information. The open source movement is the key movement here, with notions of copyleft and so on. And it's often a fundamental mistake. Issues of copyleft and open source do not involve free information. That information remains controlled by property rights, which are, at least in theory, defensible within courts.
Can you tell me what is meant by free and what is meant by open software?
The free and free software is talking about freedom the users have of the software. So I know the GNU General Public License, which is a software license, is a free software license in that it gives users of the software the right to modify the software, which involves them having the right to see the source code. So the source code will be open source. they have the right to modify the software, and they have the right to re-release their modifications as long as they use the same license, which means other people are then free to modify and re-release the software. Some open source licenses allow corporations to make modifications to the open source software and then release that as proprietary software, which then feeds back into the proprietary software model. So free software will always be open source software, but not all open source software is free software.
At least in this technical use of the sense free software. Certainly in the people that talk about these things, then free software is a broader section of things than open source software. It does not mean things that are distributed free of charge.
That's correct, yes. So often they use the word liber, from French, meaning liberty, that you're giving users liberty to modify and re-release.
What do you think is important about free and open source software?
The important thing is it's important to think that it's important, and then when it's not important you think it's not important. And it's just a question of attention, really. If you find it interesting, engage. If you find it boring, disengage. And here we are, engaging and disengaging with each other in an open sort of way.
Why do you think open source and free software is important?
Because that's a very complex question. Because it can change the way we live and the way we work, and because it provides an alternative way of working in the future, and because free software is a very good example how to work on a collaborative basis in order to create something new and something different and another world, basically.
Is that what you meant when you said it's a way of, it changes the way we work and live? What do you mean by that?
It changes the way of working without a financial incentive. A financial incentive can be also there in free software, but basically it's not necessarily. People who work on free software have other incentives to work on their free software, and that can be a model for future life.
We love our privacy. We love our open source. We love our privacy. We love our open source. We love our privacy. We love our open source. Our voices must be heard. Our voice soar into the sky and travel on particles of code.
In the 80s, a chap called Phil Zimmerman was a kind of a radical computer pioneer, software engineer, developed his own version of encryption called PGP, Pretty Good Privacy it was called, PGP. And he developed this bit of software, and what was really neat about it was very simple. So people could run it on their own PCs at home, and it was still very, very strong. And he began to put it up on websites and allow other people to download it. And there are no barriers to downloading, so people could download it in Europe and in Asia and Africa and Iraq and Libya and around the world. And this then became a huge test case in America. I think the American Customs and Excise Office started chasing Zimmerman and saying, look, we're going to take you to court, this is going to become a federal issue. And it became a real test case for the freedom to encrypt and the freedom to export and so on. And at the end of the day, Zimmerman actually won the right to export and really won the battle for everyone to send encryption wherever they wanted to.
patent on the RSA algorithm, as well as the Diffie-Hellman algorithm and a couple of other related patents. These patents were all controlled by a single company, Public Key Partners, which was a kind of a patent cartel created by RSA Data Security and Cylink, the holders of the Diffie-Hellman related patents. I didn't develop it patent free. I just developed it. It used algorithms that are claimed by patents, but I was giving it away for free. And so I felt that the need to create something that could be useful for privacy and civil liberties that I could give away free on the internet was more important for society than avoiding the patents. The patents covered all forms of public key cryptography. When I first developed PGP, the patent issues were not resolved. It took some years to finally resolve them. There were problems within the Public Key Partners patent cartel that resulted in them breaking up and suing each other. One of the parties that broke up, namely Cylink, granted me patent licenses for the Diffie-Hellman algorithm.
And that was actually Phil Zimmerman in an interview for itconversations.com, which is released on Creative Commons. It was an interview with Doug Kay.
Bought it with money. There's always been free versions of PGP. We don't keep track of how many people have the free version. There's no registration card to fill in. And also, there were versions from before there was a company, and some people are still using them. And over the years, other products have been created that use exactly the same protocol, the OpenPGP protocol, and some people use them.
The danger now with dissent being criminalised is that those digitally correct hacktivists and hackers leaning in that direction be falling under the title of cyber terrorists. And how do they protect their activities? How do they protect the continuation of being able to use this net space, this kind of ether, which doesn't contain the bodies but contains the will of hackers or hacktivists to carry a voice of dissent?
That's a very interesting question, and it is open to... It's unclear at the moment, at least to me, and that may be either because I'm not paying close enough attention or because that is the case, that post 9/11 how much have things changed, and post the various terror acts being passed in different places. It is notable that a number of things have happened since that period, and I think we should also remember at that stage that Genoa preceded 9/11, but not by very much, and Genoa itself had already provoked pretty significant reflection within the alter globalization movement about where it was going and how it was managing itself, and that there were similar reflections to a certain extent going on within some parts of kind of hacktivism. The emergence of 9/11 and the things that have gone, the war on terror and everything that's happened since then, has produced a kind of climate where people, I think, hacktivists have reflected to a certain extent more on what they're doing. Now, there haven't been as many or as public or as large mass actions online for a little time, but neither have there been as many large big city kind of demonstrations. It's not that they've disappeared, but the kind of great series of demonstrations that went, London, Seattle, Prague, Genoa, all those, Melbourne, all that series, that also has dissipated to a certain extent. So it's not necessarily hacktivism that's changed as the movement itself. On the other hand, the digitally correct hacktivists are, to a certain extent, it may have separated them off to a certain extent, because their concern really isn't necessarily some of the social justice concerns of the ultra-globalization movement, though a lot of them are actually kind of quite committed to those kind of concerns. The concern of them as a kind of group or as a movement is of free access to information. And that struggle pretty much continues, but it involves, to a certain extent, a kind of expertise-empowered group who can write code and can produce these things and who understand the kind of basic ways the internet is operating at the level of code and at the level of hardware, and can therefore intervene into those, which is not something that is open to the vast majority of us.
Sharon Hom, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights in China.
All that has happened in China's authoritarian state is it got a technological upgrade. All of the technology of repression was a lower end, but it was very effective during the Cultural Revolution. It was always been effective. Some of the empowering role of technology is that it can amplify the dissident voices and activist voices. It can generate the global support and attention we need. It can create the underground railroads. It can create the underground tunnels. And we need you to help us create them. And we need them to create a flow of uncensored information within China and in and out of China. And we need to help create the virtual spaces for Chinese citizens to meet and organize. And we need to create the shared resource libraries where they can access it and get it online. But all of this role of technology and all of these strategies has to be grounded in a material reality of China today. I'm going to talk about the Huaxia Dianzibao. It's a part of a very big, ambitious initiative. And what it is we use two methods, two technological solutions. And we send in 350,000 emails into China a week. And it's a newsletter that we compile from edited stories and censored stories that we get from inside China, that people send us that work with us. We edit it and we send it back in. So we get it, we edit it, and we send it back in. There were some real attacks on dissident sites just at the beginning of this year, and a lot of us took some very big hits and had to do a lot of major security work and re-security work. And we actually had to move our site, which was hosted in Hong Kong, out of our Hong Kong operations, and we had to move everything because it became very insecure. We need training, and we need helping to build the technical expertise in-house in our capacity. Anybody who wants to train us to unlock doors? We're there. Anything, we need to increase our technical expertise. We need tech hacker interns. We need interns. Gabe is our intern now, and boy, did it make a huge difference to have him rewriting programs, redoing leads assessment, and we're not letting him go back to school. So his mother's very upset because I said, quit school. School? What school? Who cares? You're changing the world.
Are more important. We live in the information age. We live in the information age. Today it's a toast today. We live in the information age. Toast today.
like the internet and email, it allows for the possibility of millions of people's emails to be silently and undetectably scanned by government computers searching for interesting keywords without court orders. I mean, when I say that it's possible to do it without court orders, I'm not saying that the government truly is doing that without court orders. I'm saying that the technology exists for them to do it. And in fact, they may be, in fact, I think it's very likely that they do that in other countries where where the NSA can scan email from other countries without getting court orders from the U.S. because, well, they're an intelligence agency and they're not bound by the need to have court orders for scanning email from other countries. So I felt that this was the technology was carrying us toward a future where it was becoming increasingly easy for governments all over the world to abuse the privacy of their citizens on a large scale, not just on a one-by-one basis. So cryptography is a good countermeasure to that. Let's try to solve the root of the problem involves getting at policy issues in many, many governments around the world, and that's a rather intimidating problem to try to solve. I don't know how to get governments all around the world to not spy on their citizens. You know, having all of the components of a democracy in place, an independent judiciary, a free press, elections. A lot of people just think elections is all you need, but I think as we can see in some countries that we're trying to nation build, that it takes more than elections to do that. Social expectations of the general population that their privacy and civil liberties not be abused. You know, the Russians have a reasonably good constitution, but the people there don't expect their government to respect their civil liberties and privacy, and so it doesn't happen. There's a kind of a cynicism, and cynicism can actually erode a democracy.
Where do you see the future of hacktivism going?
I think what's most hopeful in hacktivism is that both of its main currents or trends have remained closely in touch with particular communities that they get a dialogue and a politics out of, so that the kind of mass action hacktivists that are still around are still engaged with particular struggles, most of which come under roughly the kind of ultra-globalization umbrella. The digitally correct hacktivists are still very much engaged with open source and with issues of information that have been around for some time, but they're still engaged with them. Neither has kind of disappeared into a kind of self-justification of their own activism. There's a kind of self-reflexive closure that can sometimes happen in relationship to activism, where people begin to see their activism as so important that they can't see the connections outside of themselves. This is particularly the case, or I would think this is a particular danger for activists who are so technically and technologically engaged, where the actual code hasn't become the overall obsession to the complete loss of politics.
9/11, a lot of us in the crypto community thought that there might be a government crackdown on the use of cryptography, either by reimposing export controls or imposing domestic controls in the U.S. But it didn't happen. Certainly a powerful reason is the momentum that's built up in the computer industry that depends on the ability to export strong crypto and to use it domestically. It would be enormously disruptive to try to change that. Right? Enormous economic forces that have built up over the past few years in the computer industry, the software industry, and just the rest of the economy that depend on cryptography being freely available domestically and exportable to other countries. But other policies have been enacted by the government that don't relate to cryptography. The Patriot Act is full of things that are bad for privacy, bad for civil liberties, and is sort of beyond the reach of cryptographers to try to solve. We can protect email, but we can't protect citizens from pervasive surveillance technology.
Peasants on Resonance 104.4 FM.
And if this world is miles too vast and vast for you and you'd like to come and play with the slow, small peasants, you can get in touch with us by emailing ssp@diversity-radio.net. And if you want to listen again and again and again to the slow, small peasants, you will actually be able to access podcasts of our shows through the resonancefm.com site. Go to the left-hand column and click on podcasts. We are actively searching for people who want to come and play and create audio with us, because in order to podcast, we're making all of our shows under the auspices of free, not copyleft and Creative Commons licenses. So that means we need not just players and speakers, but music makers too. Come and play with us. Come and play with us.
Bye.